Hey guys! So today you and I are going to talk about not being ready. So let's get into it. So the question in question was, hi Frederick, what do you do when you're hired for a software development job where you feel you're not ready for it? I would say that you should have, and I would even go as far as to say probably that this is a general good rule, at least it's one that I've always tried to follow, and that is to make sure that you do your preparations ahead of time before a crisis comes along. Let me explain this a little bit. So, if you've done any prepping or survival training or in the military, it doesn't matter where, right? Most people will tell you that if a crisis situation occurs, it's good to have, you know, some like buckets, a little bit of food, like canned food or things like that, like these preparation things that you can have if something happens that makes you have to sort of scale back your living standards, or maybe like the lights go out or the water doesn't work or things like that, to prepare a little bit for that sort of situation. Not going crazy necessarily with it, but at least have some basics to fall back on. And when you take a job, I argue to you that you should always think in those terms, because there is this idea for some people that if you get the right job or so forth and so forth, that means that you're safe, right? You have what we call job security. And I always tell people, on average, yes, that is true. But it's a little bit, again, as with my example of a crisis within our society or like your town or something like that. On average, yes, you can assume that the water is going to work or that the electricity is going to work or things like that. But it is prudent for you to know that in theory that could change. And slight precautions are a good investment. So when you take a job, it's the same thing. You could get fired, you could have a scale down, or like the company could be making like changes within the organization. Like there's tons of various ways that even in a large corporation, or like where you feel like, yeah, there's all kinds of funding and stuff like that, that you might lose your job. And so if you take a job that you don't feel that you're sort of prepared for, that is no different, I argue, from being, say, where like I am today, where there are very few roles which I would feel unprepared to deal with, or someone who's even more experienced than me. Like we've been doing this for so many years that, it's all good, right? The difference is not in the stuff that we're going to talk about, like the preparations part. The difference is just emotions. I have the experience to feel confident when I take a job. And if you feel that you're not ready for it, it basically comes down to experience and how you feel about the situation. It's that difference. Like I did exactly the same thing when I was started. When I started my first two, three, like a few jobs, like it took years before, like some call it imposter syndrome, etc., etc. I don't want to label it as such per se, because I want you to understand that that feeling you're feeling, that you're not ready for it, it will go away if you just make sure that you practice and that you learn from the situation that you find yourself in. Because every single job, guys, is a little bit different. And after a while, as I like to say, like experience and learning and stuff like that, it's like a line. And in the beginning, like everything is a straight line where you learn new things all the time, and that might be intimidating in some situations if something's very tricky, and then you rack your brain and you try to really really solve issues or do whatever it is, right? And in some cases you're lucky, then you have a good match between the challenge that you're facing and your aptitudes and where you are experience wise. Sometimes you're unlucky and you might get fired, or you might have people get angry with you. I've been on all those situations, in all of those situations I've been, guys, all of them. And it sucks when things don't go your way, but sooner or later you're going to find that you start repeating things more than you face new challenges, and that's where comfort starts coming in, where you start to see that this is nothing new and scary every single time, and I'm starting to see a pattern in the things that I usually do, because now I've been doing this for so long that, you know, it's not intimidating anymore because it's the same thing I've done 100 times before. And so what I do, and I've done that through my entire career, guys. Make sure, number one, that your skills are relevant in the marketplace. Make sure that the regions that you want to work in and the companies like roughly understand the expectations that are going to be put on you when you go into a new hiring process. A classic one that can happen is that if you have a job and you're like lose it after a lot of time, you might find, because that is that can be something that differs quite a lot from region to region. The interviewing process and being able to actually get a new job can be a little bit tricky, even if you've been working for years and years and years, because interviews are different from the actual work. So it's a bit of a proving ground for a lot of us developers, myself included. Like, guys, you don't think that I get every single job that I apply for just because I'm like a experienced software developer. That's definitely not the case, and that's sad but true for a lot of us. So make sure that you understand your value, your market value, and update yourself and keep in touch with the communities and the hiring processes and stuff like that, so you know how to do those things, because it is, I would argue, a little bit of a skill to be able to get through an interview. Second thing is, make sure that you have a good and updated CV so that you actually get some traction on applications, or maybe you get like people coming to you. That's something that happens for me, for example. Like, people come and, ping me in like messages and emails and stuff like that about roles that they would like me to apply for and stuff like that. So keep a healthy connection with the environment or in the region, like the job market in your region. That's a very, very good investment for you. And then the rest is live, I argue. Make sure that you do living. Like, if you take this job and you don't feel comfortable with it, try to figure out what is it that makes me uncomfortable. And my personal favorite is, if I ever feel like there's something I'm not really sure of how to do, and like it feels like, yeah, get this pinch in my chest, like, because you don't have to learn every single little thing about everything, but the stuff that sort of affects you, that you get an emotional response to, or you feel like actually people are putting expectations on me to know this stuff, I always do the same thing. I create a controlled little project, like a small personal project or something like that, where I try to play around with it. I start, like I say, I poke things with a stick. So if I don't know a specific framework all that well, or a specific tool or something like that, I usually try to break it down to basics. I take whatever big gigantic application, because that's usually how it goes. Like, it's not the small stuff that you get intimidated with, it's usually the really, really large stuff, and I try to simplify it. I break all that down to the smallest level, and then I play around with the tool until I sort of understand the mechanics of the tool or the process or things like that, and I do my own research and reading and stuff like that, and then I experiment and I tinker with smaller projects until I start to sort of understand how it works at small, like in a small easy situation, and then that helps me understand more and more of how it works in the larger, like in a larger code base or in a larger project or things like that. So what I want you to take away from this is that if you get hired for a job where you feel you're not ready for it, just do this, like, take the advice of all those survival people and so forth and so forth. Make sure that you're prepared to fail, or if something happens, like, have savings, these sorts of obvious things, like you don't live within your margins and stuff like that, so that if something happens in this new job and you might have to look for other work, that you don't, it's not like the kiss of death to your entire way of life just because you might have to change roles or so forth and so forth. And that is easiest done by having relevant skills that are in line with what the market is looking for. Have an up-to-date CV, so that, and do a little bit of practicing, maybe, like, make sure that you understand how to find leads on new jobs, and that you understand how to do an interview and like what's common and so forth and so forth. There's tons of people who can give you tips on that. Myself, like, I have videos about that if you want to look at it. That's perfectly fine. And then third and lastly, make sure that you do a little bit of living, because it's very, very, very common that you will, especially in the early days, find a lot of various new things that you face in different roles and so forth. And the way you solve that is because it's through exposure. Just go through it. I promise you, your level of comfort will go up very, very dramatically if you just start seeing that, all right, So in this role I have these tools, and then the next role I have basically the same tool, but there's a few ones that are new to me and so forth, and then the third role is all the same thing and so forth and so forth. So by doing a little bit of exposure to various things, looking around a bit, it becomes less dramatic for you when something is all like deviating and things like that. It's I like to make the analogy, at one point it was probably a little bit scary for you as a kid to go to to the bathroom by yourself or things like that, right? And now it's probably not as scary because you've done it so many times that like the exposure has made you desensitized to it. Now it's just something you do, right? And that's the only, I argue, difference between someone who's really comfortable almost all the time and someone who's really, really uncomfortable, unless we talk about like genetics and stuff like that. But usually that's the difference, right? And the best way, I argue, is to understand how to learn about new topics in the way that you learn about them. Sometimes it's like very tricky to take like a really big project and understand everything about it. So what I usually do, and I still do that to this day, guys, I try to simplify the problem for me. The thing that I don't really understand, I take like Google, or read a little bit about it to get the basics, and then I try to do like a controlled experiment, and then I tinker a little bit with it until I start to say, okay, so if I poke it like that, it does that. If I poke it like that, it does that. That's the way I do it. I still do that, and I advocate that as your go-to for learning how to deal with situations or tools or stuff like that where you might not be 100% sure if you're ready for it or not. Simplify it and try, and like just repetition over and over and over until you start to get it. Have a great day.